Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and we are back for the third live conversation here. And today, Dom and I are joined by Jennifer Garcia Bashaw, who is a friend of the podcast and currently a professor at my alma mater, Campbell University. I believe it's probably why I love the color orange. As an alumnus who then uses orange as their favorite accent color. And it's like the home of all the camels that actually live in North Carolina. They're our mascot, Dom, a camel. And you didn't know that North Carolina is known for camels, but boy, have we got them.
Or for orange.
Yeah. And when I was there, we had a really cool bumper sticker that's no longer sold that said "Every day's Hump Day" at Campbell University.
I won't touch that one.
Look at that, already demonstrating discernment and wisdom. But on top of being a scholar and a friend, Jennifer is also the author of Scapegoats, which is a book exploring the gospel through the eyes of the victim, using mimetic theory and such like that. But unlike most books about it, you might actually know what mimetic theory is when you get done, and not cringe when you think about trying to interpret the execution of Jesus, which made her a very convenient conversation partner for today. And most recently, her gospel commentary on John came out in the Bible for Normal People series, and it takes seriously the narrative framing of the Gospel of John to communicate what he's up to, something Dom hinted at early on in the prologue, and I'm sure, considering a number of you sent questions on those connection points, it'd come up. But if you're a member who didn't send in your questions, you can even put them in the chat. Just put the word question in caps, then put it so I know to mark it. Otherwise, I will think you're talking amongst yourselves, and sometimes I read them, then I get distracted, and then I completely lose track of what's going on, and you're like, Trip, I thought you were hosting. You're like, no, I was distracted by the chat. So typing question is a very helpful way to do it. If you're sitting here on the stream and realize to yourself, whoa, what do you mean the lecture about the execution of Jesus? Then you missed it. All you gotta do is go to crossingclass.com and you can go watch it. Tons of visuals looking at the details of the Passion Week of Jesus leading up to his execution, putting in a historical context to help raise different kinds of questions than are often brought to the text. So with that, I'm going to let Jennifer frame our kickoff, and then we will start conversing and tackling your questions.
Sounds good. I have to say first that I have a history that's kind of like Brian McLaren's was. He talked about it before, coming from an evangelical context, that Dom was often the very caricatured. I wouldn't call him the devil. That's not what people said, but they would actually leave him out of any kind of discussion that had to do with the Gospels. And this was in my evangelical education. So I'm getting a master's of divinity. I'm getting a PhD in New Testament. And my professors were ignoring John Dominic Crossan and his work. And so I've had to play catch up since I've gotten my degree to really take in all of the amazing things that he's done in his life. And I think it's really a travesty. This is still happening in evangelical institutions. Like, they are not teaching students the full range of New Testament scholarship. They're leaving people out and caricaturing people. And I think it's a pretty sad state of things, especially considering how many of our pastors and our professors are educated at evangelical institutions. So, yeah, I'm very excited to be able to interact with Dom today, because he has been kept from me for very many years. And so I'm happy to talk so much about the passion narratives, especially the way that you approached the background. The fact that you're introducing people to Philo and Josephus and the social context and everything is so important. I'm actually a literary person, so I feel like, Dom, that you and I work together really well. You give this great historical background that is so necessary to understanding the Gospels. and then I come in and want to talk about how is it that they actually portray Jesus, and how is it that they portray Jesus' death. And so there's one thing that I've been reading lately of yours that I would love to talk about. And that is in your Who Killed Jesus book. You talk about the difference between prophecy historicized and history remembered. And another John scholar, Raymond Brown, he will talk about how the passion narratives are like 80% history remembered and 20% prophecy historicized. And then you flip that. You're at 80% prophecy historicized and then 20% remembered history. So I would love to hear a little bit more about that, because I think it's very important for our audience to understand something about that.
Well, one thing, don't take those numbers seriously at all. I mean, they're kind of, but there is a huge, if you read through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and know nothing, well, it sounds like basically they all got the same story about the passion in general. You know, anyone reading right through, my students, have ever had them do that, said by the time they got to Luke, it's the same stuff over and over again. It's all parables and miracles, you know. So you might think, now, we know, however, that Mark is the source of Matthew and Luke, and that raises a huge issue. Is John an independent version? And even at this point, this was a huge question for me. Couldn't have got the most important thing about, well, not the most important thing, but at least apart from the resurrection, couldn't have got the crucifixion down right? Wasn't somebody taking notes? Or surely Mark is writing. But then if Mark is his history, how come Matthew and Luke don't have their own account of it? How come they have to really copy him in plain language? Even if you think John for the moment. So the big question for me was twofold. Was there only basically one account of the crucifixion, basically, the passion, let's say? And if so, why so? I mean, wasn't that kind of extraordinary? That of all things, I noticed the same thing, by the way, with the resurrection. As soon as Mark stops, everyone goes into a panic. But they don't. They have their own materials. But nobody seems to have a consistent story. So the first thing I had to decide, and we may come back to that, is whether I think John is an independent passion account. Now, John is independent tradition. I'm quite certain of that. But does he have an independent passion account, or is he dependent, at least on Mark and the synoptics? And my own bias, honestly, was I wanted it to be yes, because I do my best work, you said literally, when you have two independent accounts. Mm-hmm. If you only have one, then you can't do much. So my bias really was to want John to be. Now, let me go back to the first question. When I decided, basically, and it was an historical decision, that I thought John's passion account, along with a lot of the professors from Louvain that I'd read, and Eric and people like that, so I wasn't being unique at all. But we can get into that, why I'm convinced John is dependent. But then I had this huge problem. And I began to think, well, I think what happened was, of course, the new Jesus had been crucified, of course. And I don't know what details go along with that. But what was crucial for me is when they wanted to tell the story, they didn't, as it were, keep going around asking somebody, were you there? Did you see? Like we might go to the archives in quotation marks. They went to their tradition about the suffering of Israel. They had this long tradition in the Psalms, in the prophets, of people who had suffered. It wasn't like, well, Jesus is the first Jew up on a Roman cross, or on, no. They said he's the culmination of the suffering of our people. Therefore, here's what happened. When he was crucified, they cast lots. So what I thought was fabulously profound was that Jesus died in a tissue of references to the sufferings of his people. So that's what was important for me. It was prophecy, not in the sense that all of Israel was waiting for this guy to come and fulfill all these prophecies, not at all. But in the long history of our people, he is the culmination of our suffering, not the unique person. And no, we weren't all waiting for who's the mysterious person. so it was not proof text. They hadn't got the proof text. Later, Christians would pick these up as proof texts and batter Jewish scholars over the head with them by saying, see, all of this was foretold. And that was what I wanted to say. And that was precious for me. They had written this as a tissue, and even debating, say, with Ray Brown, if he thought, well, basically, they chose all of these to describe what actually happened. There was a point at which I might say, I don't want to argue this anymore. If you say, well, basically, he may have been given something to drink, but it was told this way. At that point, I would say, okay, but I think we may have lost something. We have lost something, that Jesus died as the culmination of his people's suffering. That is a profound antidote to any type of anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism before we even begin. So that was what was at stake for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's so obvious when you look at Mark's Passion account and how much he uses Psalm 22. It's just woven completely through there. And I think we don't pay attention to it enough to talk about that. Like, I feel like there's the line that people talk about a lot, the my God, why have you forsaken me? Right? People will literally take that as the idea that God abandoned Jesus on the cross, or, looked away from Jesus's sin because the sin of the world was on Jesus, or something like that, right? But if you go back and read Psalm 22, and Mark is using it throughout his Passion account, you see there's a lot more going on in that psalm than someone saying, oh, God abandoned us. It's about suffering, and then eventually gets to how God rescues God's people, So, yeah, I think we've overlooked that too much.
Yeah. And then Mark, or Jesus has lost his faith. I mean, the worst possible interpretation. He believes that God has abandoned him. Mm-hmm. So you could do horribly bad exegesis. Yes, you see, but that's what's at stake for me, though. And any argument about did this, that's what's at stake. Mm-hmm. Should we talk a bit about John, do you think, Jennifer, about why I think, and maybe why you would be convinced, if you are, that John is a separate Passion account?
Yeah, we can talk about that. You can go first.
Well, I really, I spent the 60s in a monastery. A lot of people had more interesting lives in the 60s, I hear. But I was in a monastery, and I had nothing else to do but study. Study was prayer in a monastery. I loved it, by the way. And I spent a huge amount of time remedially reading the Gospels like this: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's the only way I ever read them. Here's the sort of thing. Let's give one example. Mark's account of the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus is prostrate on the ground, and he says, let this chalice pass from me if possible. And then eventually he's abandoned by everyone. It's a terrible scenario. It's like Jesus dies as a human being abandoned by everyone. Now I shift over to John. I find that the whole troop of Spira, 600 troops that come to get him, they're flat on the ground. And Jesus says, of course I'm going to accept the cup of my Father. And instead of being abandoned by everyone, he says, kind of thinking, fulfilling everything, okay, let these guys go. You came for me, let them go. He orders them. Now, I find that pattern going through it, that Jesus is running the crucifixion. Really. So it's almost like Mark, I see Jesus as a human being flattened to the ground. Yeah. John, I see Jesus as sort of a divine being. And how do you crucify a divine being? Very carefully. So I find this pattern running through, and that goes into the burial too, that if I took Mark and was told as my doctoral dissertation, put Jesus in charge of the whole thing, and here's your data, I'd come out like John. Mm-hmm. That was one of my crucial arguments, really.
I actually agree with you. I think John did have Mark, like all of it. Actually, I think he interacts with Mark back and forth throughout the whole thing. But in the Passion narrative, you're right. He's in dialogue with what Mark has said, and he wants to present the more divine-ish Jesus rather than the suffering human on the ground. So yeah, so I agree with you on that one, 100%.
Okay.
Mhm.
Anything else? Then we can go to.
Yeah, there's actually a question specifically about this, that in the lecture you're going through the moments in the Passion Week, one of which is his entrance into the temple. And this is a place I think I'd love to hear you both talk. And there are two different people. Let's see, Amanda and Jeremy both asked about the temple cleansing scene. And in the Gospel of John, it's at the beginning of the gospel, and the synoptics, it's at the end. And if we're thinking of what each of those kind of tellings of the outline are doing, what's going on with moving the temple cleansing at the beginning if he, I guess, didn't do it twice?
Jennifer, can you begin with this one then?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons I think that John could have moved the temple cleansing to the early part of his narrative. But I think there's tension that he's like trying to ramp up in his narrative, I think. And so putting Jesus against the temple authorities there early on kind of gets that relationship going. And so you end up kind of seeing religious authorities in general pushing against Jesus more from the very beginning. So there's like that tension that ramps up, and then you feel it all the way through. Also, in John's story world, it's the raising of Lazarus that is sort of the last straw. And so I think he has to take the temple away from the end, because he's trying to say that the raising of Lazarus is the last straw that got the religious authorities so upset.
Yeah, complete agreement.
Well, in what would the raising of Lazarus, if you think of that as kind of the sign in the Gospel of John that initiates the cooperation of powers to lead to his execution, what's being communicated in that sign for John? And how, does it have resonance, like the content of the symbolic communication, with what's going on in the other Gospels, or is it a kind of unique emphasis or take from John?
That's a good question. I think it's a unique emphasis for John, because I think the big problem with what's happening with Lazarus is that there's so many people there and they've witnessed this, and it's right outside of Jerusalem, and it's like, getting people to go after him, as the authorities say. So I think it's a little bit of a different emphasis, but I'd love to hear what Dom thinks about it.
Yeah. I may have a different understanding of the purpose of the Lazarus story. I'm not convinced that for the author, it's like the magnificent thing. I think he's coming very close to lampooning it. I'll tell you why. I mean, the physicality is a little bit, he's 4 days and he smells. And then when it says, raise him up, John kind of negates it. No, that's not what it's about. If you believe in me now, that's what it's about. You will not die. Now, right in the middle of this story, we've changed the meaning of dying. At the beginning, it really is dying and smelling, to put it bluntly, and being in the tomb 4 days. And then he comes out, and that's sort of negated. Said, but if you believe in me, you do not die. Now, excuse me, then we've changed the word, because yes, you do die. What happens afterward, that's separate. But so I think John is sort of almost satirizing the idea of physically coming out. It's almost as if the similar, I don't want to draw any close comparison, in the story, the parable in Luke, where he says, if they don't believe the prophets, they won't even believe if somebody comes back from the dead. So I'm not convinced that we should take this like as the great Jesus raises Jairus' daughter, but maybe she was asleep. Then there's the widow's son at 9, when he's at least going to the graveyard. So, and then you have the grand finale, Lazarus. I would be convinced, except for that crucial statement: if you believe in me, you will never die. That's changing the game. So I'm not sure of the intention of the author at that stage. And then, of course, they interpret that, and therefore we're going to kill him, which is completely silly, and even conceptually. So I'm inclined to think that John may be against this idea, at least of the caricature of coming back to life. Because it kind of, Lazarus just comes back to life and nobody says what happens. So I think John is kind of lampooning that, at least, the understanding of resurrection as coming back to life for a while, and then off you go somewhere. But basically, you're around, and as if I could use Luke once again, you could just have dinner and it would just be the same as if you before. You could have bread and fish, and not symbolically. So that's the way I would see the Lazarus story.
Well, this actually, I think, sets up one of the questions that came in, and it's a long question, so I won't read the whole thing. I'll read the last line after I summarize it. But there was a description of how both Dom in these lectures and in some of the other lecture series has told the story of having to negotiate the confessional boundaries that were stated and unstated for kind of critical scholarship growing up, especially before Vatican II. And that he talked about how in his dissertation, he's looking at it, I guess, like the infancy narratives, and like not going to discuss whether or not he literally went into Egypt to signal being a new Moses or not. You're just talking about what's happening in the text and these kind of things there. And you can even see that right in the Who Killed Jesus, the contrast between Raymond Brown's work and Dom's. And Jennifer, in our previous conversations and even at the beginning here, right, you talked about how in a confessional context, in an evangelical space, there are different like do's and don'ts and these kind of a prioris that you have to skirt around or not be explicit on and such. And the questioner kind of gave examples of things both of you have said on the podcast, and then said, I started taking these classes going, all right, I want to figure out what the correct answer is if you're smart. And then, right, like even here, you can see how no one may have even heard how both of you just read the exact same text in John. They have different ways of understanding the whole text, and it's people who've given their whole lives to understanding it critically. And you both like engage critically, and it's reshaped your own understanding of faith in the world. And there's a resonance between you, even if you don't get to the same reading. And so the question goes this way. I would love to hear Jennifer and Dom explain what kinds of certainty they look to in the text when the final answer isn't what you get through critical scholarship. Is it just a better answer for this day? And if so, why is the better answer for this day good enough? And in knowing different generations, obviously Dom growing up in Catholic Ireland and a pre-Vatican I Catholicism, Jennifer and South and American evangelicalism, they're different contexts, but those tensions are there. And yeah, sorry, I probably should just read the whole thing.
I think Dom should go first on this one.
Okay, all right. Basically, it was not my dissertation. It was in the because I got a doctorate in theology first, and then they let me into the scripture. That was the Catholic system. Nobody gets to go to scripture straight. You had to get theology first, which is fine with me. I had to be very careful in the Biblical Institute in Rome in the years 59 to 61, just before the Vatican Council, even with very good professors. I was arguing in the thesis was on the two chapters of Matthew 1 and 2, and I was arguing that all of that was based on the parallelism with Moses. Everything, flight into Egypt, of course, wrong direction, and the slaughter of the innocents. Now, what I didn't say, I couldn't say, was it was all made up. I mean, that's a blunt way of putting it. There was like a giant parable. I wouldn't have known it probably at that time to be smart enough to say it was a parable, because you can't be against parables. That's what Jesus does. Anyway, no problem with presenting the whole thing. I just never said, and there was no, for a thesis, a master's, there was no oral defense. So I wasn't afraid that somebody was going to ask me, do you think this was all invented? In which case I would have said yes. And I don't know what would have happened at that stage, to be honest with you. But both my professors, as I said, I graduated with the licentiate in June of 61. Both my professors, Zerwick and Leonet, were forbidden to teach that fall. They were forbidden for a whole year to teach until Vatican II reinstated them. So yes, I had to be careful. Now, to be honest with you, what happened after that, once I moved to DePaul, I always said what I thought. And if my president got complaints from the Cardinal Archbishop, he was a lawyer, by the way. He had been head of the legal department at DePaul. He was a priest, of course. And his answer was, well, what do you want me to do? He's a full professor, a tenured full professor. What should I do? Which was the only way to handle a bully, put it right back to Cardinal Cody. But what got me tossed out was for nothing I ever said about the Bible. I simply said, with all due respect, the Pope was wrong on the encyclical about birth control. That was in the fall of, what are we talking about? 68. It came out in August of 68, and I was on radio and I was asked about it. And I said, well, the Pope is wrong about that the only form of birth control acceptable is either rhythm or abstinence, and everything else is a mortal sin. I said, well, he's the Pope. He got that wrong. I thought it was nice and simple. Cardinal Archbishop of Chicago said 1 week before you get tossed out of the diocese. So in one sense, my problem was not with exegesis of the Bible, but exegesis of the papacy. That was the flashpoint.
Mm-hmm. First of all, I'll say what makes your work so valuable, Dom, is that you have been able to say what you think. And you're out there, you're putting all of your work out there in an honest way. And the reason that I value that so much is that there's so much of my education. I've read people who are so bound by their confessional tradition or evangelical spaces, and so they don't say things that they should say. And you even get the idea when you're reading them, oh, they don't actually believe this. Like, they're operating within the bounds of what they have to operate with because of their institutions or because of their church traditions or whatever. And so we get like half the story all the time, I feel like. And that's sort of where I spent a lot of my scholarship, is knowing what I could and couldn't say. And so I would try to explore the areas that I could be honest in, and then I left the areas that I couldn't be honest in to the side. But I think to answer the question when it says, like, so what kind of reading are you looking for now? If you do feel freedom, what kind of reading am I looking for? And I think it depends on my context. Like, if I am interpreting scripture for a classroom, then there's going to be different questions I'm asking, different things that I can teach them, try to find like common ground of where they are theologically and where I am, and so where we can communicate. But if I'm interpreting scripture for a particular church, then I also have to figure out, like, what do they need and how can I interact with this? So I tend to interact with the narrative the most, because I can talk about how this story and how John tells this story or how Mark tells this story, and I can be thinking, okay, it didn't really happen, but I don't have to say that. The people who are listening to me, my students or whatever, can immerse themselves in the story with me, and then we can interpret together, but we don't have to come to the spot where we say, oh, well, this definitely didn't happen. So I have to be careful still in the classroom, and then of course in church settings as well.
One other thing that is happening to me right now in America, now I find I have to say due diligence and fiduciary responsibility means to tell the truth and the whole truth, because we're getting too much lies coming at us, even pictures. I mean, I'm arguing here showing images, but we all know they can be photoshopped now, because they can be totally false if you want to. So in one sense, you have to almost pledge your fiduciary responsibility that you've done due diligence. And yes, you are telling the truth as you see it, not your truth. I never use that term. It's my interpretation, yes. And if somebody says, well, why should I hear your interpretation? Well, the only reason is I give you the evidence I have. When you're finished, I like, if we had more time, I give you the whole story about why I think John, and then at the end of it, you say, I think you're nuts. Fair enough. Or I think you're right. I mean, that's all we have. In a court of law with life and death in the balance, 12 people have to make a decision beyond a reasonable doubt. We don't have anything else. We have faith, of course, but that comes from a different world.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that got raised in the lecture on the execution of Jesus is a host of features as you go through it, where it concludes with this. You describe it as a parable of the rule of Roman civilization versus the rule of God's post-civilization. And part of all the historical intricacies of what happens in the Passion Week, and then setting it in the context of the emergence of nonviolent resistance to empire, is to problematize the way so often this story gets inscribed theologically into a system of power, where the cross builder now gets to tell you the meaning of his cross bearing, and you're kind of going at it and challenging it historically, but that question of power and how power reinscribes itself on the cross is also something that happens in interpreting the execution of Jesus theologically as well, right? In theories of the atonement. Something Jennifer's spent time on. So I'm wondering, Jennifer, what kind of connections you see in these habits, both in trying to tell the story, project on the historical context a story that justifies a kind of anti-reading to an anti-reading theologically.
Okay, I see. If I'm trying to make sure I understand your question.
Like mimetic theory, right? Is in many sense it is challenging the normalizing of imperial power in interpreting the cross.
Okay.
And this historical reading of Jesus' execution is problematizing the way we silence the conflict of power in the historical event.
Yeah, because I do think Gerard lines up very well with what Dom talks about when he talks about the civilization and the post-civilization. Like the way that empire and world works is contrary to the way that God's reign or God's rule works. Gerard works like that because he talks about how what happens on the cross is basically Jesus showing us who we are. Jesus is taking like sort of the effect of empire, and it's displayed on the cross, and he's showing that to us so we can look around us and say, oh, this is what happens in our civilizations. This is what happens at the heart of us. We have this violence that we participate in, or we are complicit in, or whatever it is. And so Gerard's trying to say that it's not that God is sacrificing Jesus or anything like that, but what happens on the cross is that we see in a mirror what civilization has done to us and does to us, so that we can recognize the power of empire and push against it. So I think Gerard and Dom are very close in that.
Yeah, if I pick up the title of his book from Matthew, Things Hidden Since the Beginning of the World, but also feed into it Paul talking about the mystery hidden from all time. I think what Paul sees as the mystery hidden is when the Messiah comes, God will, now I'm careful of the verb, God will allow the Messiah to be publicly, officially, legally crucified by the greatest empire the world has ever known. The Jews knew about empires. They've been with them for 500 years at least. I think for Paul, that revealed the savage heart, not of Rome, but of civilization. And for me, Rome was simply civilization and a toga, the incarnation of civilization. I think that's what strikes Paul. What price law? What price, we might say, law and order, justice, all the vaunted things that Rome announces it has brought to you savages. They crucified. Now, I think if Paul's theology would have been totally different if Jesus had done everything he ever did, including resurrection, but had died quietly in his bed at Nazareth. I don't think Paul's theology would be the same. How would it be like? I won't get into it. But I think what is terrible is that the Messiah has been legally, not lynched by a mob or run over by a chariot, or executed formally. I think that's what strikes him. Mm-hmm. What price civilization? And that's the heart, I think, of Paul. Everything else for me follows from that. So that's René Girard's title of the book from the 80s, Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World. That's what was hidden.
Mm-hmm. And so what I think people have done in over many years in church history, when they have come up with these atonement theories, is that they're taking usually models from their own context and like placing it on the text in various places, and then also like picking out particular verses to work into these theories, like penal substitutionary atonement, or even Christus Victor, ransom theory, right? Instead of like following the whole story of the Bible and kind of seeing what's happening then in Jesus's death. So I think that we get really far away from, especially how the Gospels are trying to portray Jesus's death, when we start going into theories like PSA or something like that.
The one we were talking about there, I call it a parable of, when Jesus is talking to Pilate about my kingdom. That would be a good example. If somebody wants to argue with me, no, it's in the Bible, therefore it must have happened. Okay, fine. Jesus and Pilate are talking, let's say in Latin, whatever, Jesus knows Latin. Fine, but listen to what they said. So I try not to get distracted. But if somebody says, I don't think that actually happened, I will tell them, my belief is that this is a superb parable. It's the best parable since Jesus stopped telling parables, because it sums up the whole thing. Here it is. This is the difference. Pilate, you got your troops there. Where are my troops? Mm-hmm. It's the whole thing for me in a parable. Mm-hmm. If somebody wants to insist, then fine. Let's not get distracted with that one. Mm-hmm. You know what I think? But I'm talking to this mythical person. But let's imagine it happened. Now let's focus on what was said. Mm-hmm. Maybe go on.
I love that you call that a parable, because there's been a big deal made in scholarship of how there are no parables in John, right? Yeah. But because we define parables as Jesus saying, and let me tell you a parable, but instead you're actually taking these things that John is trying to communicate and saying, yeah, this is a parable. I think that's very helpful.
Yeah.
One of the things about actually that section, and this is dangerous when a theologian decides just to make connections between his Bible scholar friends. You'll tend to find us, like eager to footnote you and never find out if we did it correctly. But actually, it was in that section of the lecture, Dom, where you talk about this parable of the rule of civilization, when Jesus says to Pilate, and I think the way you put it at the end is like, my kingdom is not from here. Right, that you're not getting this, yeah. And that is this parable at the beginning, where a gospel that begins with like the eternal word in sandals bit, which is one of my favorite Dom lines. This is what God looks like in sandals, and when you think of what's going on there, it to me it seems like John's Christological energy is very different than how it gets picked up by the 3rd century, where John becomes a justification for a very high, a high Christology, but one that gets codified in a kind of bonding of civilization's hierarchies into a religious one. If the word of God made flesh ends in a parable where you're controlling your execution to revealing the powers of death that are being conquered, and they aren't anticipating it. To me, that's like a theological invitation to understand ultimacy in light of Jesus, not to reinterpret Jesus in light of an abstract ultimacy. And that move of saying, if you put it in the way John Sobrino puts it, liberation theologian, like where he goes like, the first person, if you're a Christian, is interpreted in light of what the second one said, did, and endured, not the other way around. And to me, like that capstone moment of thinking of this parabolically in the way John does the Passion, and then putting it with the prologue, the Gospel of John's high Christology is also one that demands our understanding of God be shaped from the dirt of this gospel telling, and not be the justification for the religitimation or the redivinization of civilization, empire, domination system, etc.
I would add something to that too. I have no problem either with Paul or John, no matter how high the Christology is. Now, if they get into Greek philosophies and substances and all of that, that's fun. That's trying to keep Constantine from crucifying you.
I'm going to tell my students that it's fun. I don't get that when I try to explain Platonism.
All right. Where was I going with that? In the 4th century, you've got Constantine. Now, I take Roman imperial theology. That's my phrase. I keep reading articles by classicists talking about the imperial cult, and especially in our language. Cult is a bad word. No, Roman imperial theology is about as high a theology as anyone ever finds in the New Testament for Caesar Augustus. And everyone else tries to get it from him like a creeping contagion. But for Augustus, I mean, if you really take it seriously and look at even what's left over in the ruins and the texts and everything else, you couldn't do a higher Christology than Caesar Augustus. You could do one in opposition to him, but you won't get any higher. You might get a different one. So I have no problem with somebody saying, well, this is a high Christology. Of course it is. Otherwise, nobody would be listening to them. They were living in a high, what am I going to say, Caesarology. So the only thing that would be listened to was equally high Christology. Sorry, that's a postscript kind of.
Yeah, I mean, to comment on what you were talking about, Tripp, if I can bring Gerard back into it, I think it can be helpful. But when you think about the idea that Gerard has is that, the people who are scapegoated in society are those who are on the outskirts, those who are oppressed, those whose voices are not heard, right? And that is the case with Jesus and the people that he's around in his ministry. It's also the case with the writers of the New Testament. Like, they are Christians who are scapegoats for Rome. But then once they become the people in power, once they become the oppressors, then they start scapegoating other people. And so it just makes sense that that the interpretation of scripture would be sort of like covered by that idea that, oh, now we're the scapegoaters, so we can't tell this story about the scapegoat. It'll shine too much light on what we're doing, right? So that's kind of, I think, what happened in history.
Yeah. The only thing we have going for them is some of the stuff got written ahead of time. So they could imagine if everything had been oral traditions or liturgical rites, right, until Constantine finally said, I want a Bible. Oh, we'd have a lovely Bible. It would be beautiful. It would be homogeneous and everything would be lovely. But unfortunately, there's stuff there already.
Well, one of the questions Cynthia sent in from the group, she said, Jennifer, since Jennifer just wrote a book on the Gospel of John, how does she understand Dom's contention earlier in the prologue that the writer of the Gospel was introducing anti-Judaism into the Gospel by using the term the Jews in place of the people or the crowd used in the other Gospels? Mm. And if Dom, you feel free to ask Dom a question, because that's just her short summary of what, is a rather long presentation.
I go back and forth on this idea. because I do think it is a literary device, right, to talk about the Jews, and they are like a character. And depending on where you think John was written and what was the community involved, it seems more like a critique within a family, right? Instead of looking outside. So I think that's one explanation that you could say for saying maybe that he doesn't intend for this to be anti-Judaism or anti-Semitism or something like that. But because it has been used so much against the Jewish people, like you can't deny that there is at least a latent possibility for there to be anti-Judaism there in his characterization of the Jews. So I don't know. I go back and forth on that. Like I don't know what was in the mind of John and the authors of John, but it does seem like there could be something more of like a familial. This is the Jewish group here. This is our Jewish group here, and we're going to be talking about the Jews because they're the other group, right?
And I would see that very much valid for Matthew. I think Matthew is a fight within the family. Matthew may even be a Pharisee, certainly a rabbi, as he would call himself, maybe even a Pharisee. So it's nasty within what he says about them being brood of vipers and hypocrites. I'm sure they were saying equally nasty stuff about him at the time. So I take that for granted. A fight within the family is nastiest. The Cardinal Archbishop of Chicago once said he wasn't worried about me because I was an apostate. Now, if I was a heretic, you'd have trouble, but apostates are gone. But within the family, it can get very nasty. Now, I'm inclined to think, though, what's going on in John is that John has much more a Samaritan, or Samaritan traditions, or something. I see two things there. I see the whole Samaritan pull, the woman at the well, for example. And I wonder when he says the Jews, is that what, I mean, Josephus can use the term Jews and he's not negating Judaism. He's a Jew. But I'm wondering if he's speaking like a Samaritan. Does John look like what a Samaritan or a Samaritan group or a Samaritan community who has converted, let us say, I don't know if I want to say to Messianic, maybe to even Mosaic, to a Mosaic version. Is that what it looks like? And so when he's talking about Jews, is it to dismiss the Jews? Well, would Samaritans dismiss Jews? Would Jews dismiss Samaritans? Well, yeah, we kind of know that that's a fight within the broader family, not in Judaism, but within Judaism. So I'm inclined to put it in that thing. But the more important thing, I think, is what you've just said. It's ferociously dangerous. I mean, to be honest with you, of course, you can go to the prophets and find and the Psalms and find all sorts of unspeakable things said about their own people.
That's right.
If we wanted to quote them, some of the Psalms, the history of Judaism sounds like a long catalog of betrayal. Yeah, that's the prophetic internal criticism. And when people or a church or a country lacks that strong internal criticism, which may be read by outsiders, of course, of saying, oh, yeah, that's the way they are. Fine, but it's more important for your own conscience to do your internal criticism, and then you have to risk what it may happen with people who may use it for their own ends.
Yeah. I think the difference is, I think between my position and yours is maybe just where we think the Gospel of John comes from. But I definitely think there's something Samaritan going on there, whether there's Samaritans within the community and they're trying to talk about the difference between Jewish Christians, Samaritan Christians, or something like that. So yeah, I think that's fascinating.
And is that connection to Samaritans in part because you get the story of the woman at the well in John and not elsewhere?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But also, of course, that they say we believe now, not because of you, but because we have heard. So, I mean, there's more there than just a nice story of the woman at the well, even there's a bit misogyny, but there's more acceptance there. Yeah.
So one of the questions, it both came in and Constance put it here in the chat. She asked, why is the Roman centurion included at the cross? He certainly doesn't speak for the imperial power, but it's hard to see it as a genuine confession of faith. What are your thoughts on this guy? And one of the emails that came in was asking about the centurion as like the odd observation of the centurion, the more you understand the empire's role in the execution itself.
Mm-hmm.
Did you want to start, Jennifer, in this one?
No, you can start on this one.
Okay. Well, first of all, you have to see who we're talking about. In Mark, of course, is a complete critique of the authority of the 12, of Peter, you know that, of Peter, James, and John, and finally of Judas as the 12. So consistently through it, it's the outsiders. It's the woman who anoints him because finally she believes if I don't get to anoint him now, he's going to rise and I never get to anoint him. So the woman who anoints Jesus is the first person, a woman, who actually believes him. And the women for Mark now, who go to the tomb to anoint him, don't quite get it. So there's all sorts of outsiders, the marginalized ones who get it in Mark. And of course, in Mark, the centurion is a confession of faith. Now, do I think that happened underneath the cross? No, I don't. But again, this is parable. He's making a statement of that. It's the outsiders. And so you have a woman before the crucifixion who accepts Jesus and anoints him because she'll never get another chance. She believes him, actually. No, the disciples don't seem to believe him. They seem to want to chat about first seats in the kingdom. And the other outsider is a male, female male. You might say Jew, Gentile, I suppose, possibly Jew, Gentile. And he confesses. So yes, it is a confession. And if you say, well, that's unbelievable, of course it's unbelievable. It's tended to say it's the outsiders, male, female, Jew, Gentile, who are the future. It's a kind of an indictment of the 12. You ain't the future because you don't even do what you're supposed to do. Go back to Galilee and start all over. Like I told you, I think this is a criticism of the Jerusalem-based descendants of the 12. That's what I think is going on in Mark.
Yeah, I agree. I also want to reiterate what you said about, I guess you would call it maybe universalization, as you bring people in that have confessions about Jesus that are not the typical people, that are women, that are, centurions or whatever. It talks about the universal experience of what the cross is. It's not just for that community or just for Jewish people or Jewish males, right? It's much more a much bigger picture that's going on here. So I think that's what's happening too.
And by the way, when you lose the centurion, you've lost the army. The centurions would be, I don't know enough to be sure about this, but maybe the drill sergeant major. Who is the representative of, say, the American, ain't the generals? Who is the infrastructure representative? It's the centurion. Boy, if you lose the centurion, you're losing your empire.
Yeah.
Do you think, and this is a question from Carl, that on Friday in the Passion Week, did Jesus expect his disciples to rally in Galilee and continue nonviolent resistance?
That I would have no idea of. I think Jesus had started a movement. I get that from Josephus. I get that from Tacitus, by the way. He started a movement. He had supporters. That's coming to Galilee, to Jerusalem. So now there's supporters in the major city, in this pilgrim city. I think Jesus knew exactly after John the Baptist how dangerous it was. I don't think, as I said, he went to get himself killed, but he knew it could happen. He almost got away with it because of the danger of a riot. Almost got away with it. So I do not think that Jesus had any ideas what would happen after.
And I also,
sorry.
Yeah, I can't speak to what Jesus was thinking, but I can speak to kind of how the gospel writers tell their story and what they might be leading us to think. And I think mostly they portray, at least the male disciples, as not losers, but they are thick, they're dense, they're not understanding what's happening. In Mark, Jesus predicts his suffering death like 3 times and they just don't get it. So I think we're supposed to believe that it's going to be really hard for these guys to kind of follow Jesus and keep on with the movement, but they portray the women disciples way better than that, right?
Mhm.
The women disciples are the ones that are, well, in Luke, supporting his ministry. They're in all the Gospels, the ones that are at the cross, and all the Gospels, the ones that are at the tomb. And so I don't know, maybe the Gospel writers are trying to say, yeah, this movement can go on, but we need the women really to make sure that happens.
Yeah, no, that's because they're the ones that tell us what happened and what they saw. Yeah.
It is the um this was a fun question, and I'm trying to think of I couldn't imagine how to do it, but the question was, what do you think would happen? And if you got to hang out at the eschatological banquet and Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are sitting there talking about what happened on Passion Week, like what are the unique things, each of them, if they're like sitting there, like these four gospels, if you line up the details, they don't line up very well, and yet they were canonized. So like if you put the intentions of the four gospels in the voice of one person, and they're sitting there having a conversation, what are the kind of threads of connection and unique elements that show up if we were to sit and look at the way the execution of Jesus plays out in each of them?
I would love to have the four of them having a symposium and going at one another. I want to be Mark. I want to talk to those two guys that plagiarized me. No, John. But seriously, I mean, it would be a great way of educating people about think difference. Don't run them all together into one homogeneous diatessaron, you know. Give each of them their powerful individuality.
Mhm.
Really. And then realize that we have a tradition here, because it's not just four going off. There is a tradition. And where do you plug into that tradition? Are we just dependent on them? Or are we supposed to, without pushing this, are we supposed to have our own gospel today? And if we're going to have it, we better read the mega models well to make certain we get it right. Because we have four slants on it. I think that's kind of fantastic, because the 2nd century Marcion and Tatian thought this doesn't make any sense. We don't want four. Let's get rid of it. Get rid of any three of them. We keep Luke for Marcion or Tatian. Let's put them all together. It's really weird. Anyone then could read them and compare them, and it didn't bother them.
Mm-hmm. I love so much. This is my favorite part about studying the Gospels is all of their differences and kind of what are their themes that they highlight, and what are the words that they like to rally around and things like that. But when you get to the execution of Jesus, that is where they are the most similar of anywhere in the whole gospel accounts. They're so similar.
Yeah.
And so the differences that would stand out to me that I would talk about would be in John. And I'm thinking about the spear, when Jesus is speared and then the blood and the water come out, which is so different than what the other gospel writers say. I love the interpretations that have been a little more recent about these. This is birthing imagery. The blood and water coming out of Jesus is like birthing imagery for the birth of the church, and which makes a lot of sense with Jesus talking to his mother and the beloved disciple and saying, kind of putting them together in a family. That makes a lot of sense. But I think that is so unique to John that I'm fascinated by that. That's what I would want to talk to him about.
Ooh, okay. I really hope all the clergy wrote down blood and water as birthing imagery. That just sounds like when you get to a text, you've already gone through the liturgical calendar 5 times, and you're like, what am I going to pull out the old one again? You're like, no, you know what to grab everyone's attention? Birthing fluid day. I don't know what kind of participatory element you could come up with. You could really, depending on, how strict everyone is on the elements, you could have a whole thing there.
Well, in John, Jesus has a womb. You know that, right? Like there's a word when the living waters come out of Jesus, it's his koilia. It's his womb, but it never gets translated like that. They say it's his belly. So there's a lot more going on in John when it comes to like feminine imagery than most people realize.
Mm-hmm. Well, what do you think there were a couple of questions about this, Jennifer, of kind of like how the kind of work that takes place when you're doing historical investigation gets played out within the life of the church. And I think in particular, the excellent promotion of the Jesus Seminar in its early days also generated this kind of backlash where people don't end up reading it. And this is and so you get these kind of framings that aren't the kinds that actual scholars have, right? Like when you're trying to think of the likelihood of Jesus saying X, Y, and Z, that somehow that if you read what Jesus says in the Passion story in John, it's all in black, means like that's bad and not real. Even though Dom said there, it was like, what was the conclusion to his lecture on the execution of Jesus? He's like, probably the greatest parable after Jesus stopped having original material in John chapter 18, right? So there is this some kind of like gap where that critical historical scholarship in one setting actually allows you to hear John with a kind of ferocious passion all of his own, and challenge you in ways that then the moment you're like, well, they use beads and Jesus didn't say it, and therefore I don't even know if he believes it and it's true. Like, is someone who kind of like is both introducing that kind of scholarship and realizes what kind of gift that a kind of faithful yet critical form of engaging scriptures can generate. Are there starting points? Are there like, have you learned lessons and wisdom for how to do it well? Because I think it's bad for us to, as Christians, bear false witness, especially if it's against our own who just happen to do exegesis differently. And in a sense, right, if you're bearing false witness against all four gospel writers, if we tell them that their true conclusions were Nicaea, the Baptist Faith and Message, Luther's Catechism, or whatnot.
Mm-hmm. It's so hard to introduce the historical stuff to a more evangelical or conservative audience. So it kind of depends on, your context, church, or my context in the classroom. But I think what I try to do is to talk to them about genre first, like talk to them about what the gospel writers were writing. What did they have as models when they're talking about Jesus's life? And it's like Roman lives, Roman autobiographies. And how did they write history? They didn't write it like reporters did. Like what they were doing is trying to capture their subject, the characteristics of their subject, and they felt fine coming up with long speeches that aren't historical. So I kind of talk about that, and that the kind of history that we think about as history today is not ancient history. And so then I talk about the genre of the Gospels and how they might be trying to communicate truths about Jesus by talking about other things. And so then we don't necessarily start with the historical conversation, like, did this happen? But say, what are the gospel writers trying to say about Jesus in this? Like, that's sort of how I tend to do it. But
yeah, and it's dangerous in a way, except it's therapeutic to start with, did it really happen? Because then you never get past that. And that was, in the Jesus Seminar, we had different people in there. There were some people in the audience also who would, in a way, want to hear, well, so it didn't happen, so it's all rubbish. Yeah, that was there in the audience, and we're still getting them. If you read some of the responses, you get that. Thank you for confirming me that this is useless. That's all right. We all had to get over Santa Claus, so some people aren't. But still, I mean, the real question is, if it didn't happen, what is the point of it being there? That's the real question. Why is it there? Of all the things that Jesus and Pilate could have said to one another, why was this the one thing they had to say? And if at that stage, to repeat myself, if you want to say they had a 2-hour conversation, but John only recorded this, okay, this must be the most important part of that 2-hour conversation. So if people want to really converse, you can bracket certain stuff and say, okay, here's what I want to focus. But then you have to, for me, I have to tell the truth. If you say, but do you think that really happened? I would say no. But let's get back to what it means when an author made it up then. And I usually use parable because most people, you can say, Jennifer, I don't think most people would worry that the prodigal son didn't actually happen. Would that be worried in evangelical circles? No, I mean, they would take it for granted. It's a fiction. That's a good word for it. It's a made up story. But at the end of the made up story, Luke could still say, go and do likewise. Oops. So how do you go and do likewise? You dress yourself up as a Samaritan and cruise up and down the Jerusalem-Jericho road looking for somebody in the ditch? See, of course not. Everyone knows it. But you have to interpret the parable before you know how to go and do likewise.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm hoping that if we use parable especially, it won't have a shock value that maybe a term like myth or fiction might have. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a valid term. I really think it's a valid term.
One thing that I do differently than you, Dom, I think, and it's because I'm working with 18 to 21-year-olds, they're younger. If they ask me, do you think this happened? They usually don't ask me that. But if they do, I'll say, there's no way we can know for sure. Okay. So then, I don't want to undermine their trust in me. Like if I'll say no, then they will not trust me for the rest of the semester.
Is that right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, because you say this didn't happen. Well, I don't even know why I need to listen to you. So I have to be a little more strategic about it.
I think probably if I was confronted with that situation, I would detour into parable immediately.
Yeah. Right.
I wouldn't. Can I ask you a question? Do you know the story of the prodigal son? Of course. Do you think that really happened? Well, then how could you say go and do likewise? Mm-hmm. Tell me how to go and do likewise in the parable. What are you going to do? Now, I'm sure they think if I find somebody in the distress, I should do this. So they will interpret. Now, then I would say, well, since when Jesus talked about God, Jesus talked in fictions. I might inch into that one. Do you think it's all right when the writers talked about Jesus that they might have picked up this bad habit from Jesus and use parables? Mm-hmm. I would try. I don't mean I do it right away, but I try and detour towards parable so that later they wouldn't come back and say, well, I wasn't told the truth, the whole truth. I was told the truth, but not the whole truth.
Yeah.
So far as you can tell the whole truth. So I find parable, because in the 60s, we had the same problem with Catholics. They'd never read the Bible before. The first thing they were hearing about the Bible was what was happening in the Second Vatican Council, 62 to 65. I was, as I said, in the monastery, but then we were being invited out from the monastery into the adjacent parishes, which never happened before. On Wednesday nights, we were invited out to Roman Catholic parishes to say, what's this Bible stuff? We had the total difference. It was marvelous because they had no preconceptions. And they knew the stories of Jesus, of course, but they might have known them from Stations of the Cross or rosaries. They probably had not actually read them in the Bible. They might have read them in the Missal, but they hadn't read them in the Bible. So in one sense, we didn't have the problem. They just wanted to know. And one thing I did, to start off, the first night, I used to take the 3 accounts in Luke, in Acts, of the conversion of Paul, give it to them in parallel columns, and ask them to tell me what they saw. Now, knowing that when you read chapter 9, you're going to chapter 22, and you're going to chapter 26, why doesn't he just tell the same story?
Yeah.
Or say, as I've told you already, and they were good. People would read it, in parallel columns, and yet they read it pretty good. Then you could go to take parallel columns with the Gospels. So,
yeah, the one that I use with the Gospels is the woman who anoints Jesus. Yeah. I mean, Matthew and Mark are really similar, but Luke is completely different, and then John is Mary of Bethany. So it's really fun to do it that way. Yeah,
that's a marvelous way to do it. That's perfectly valid.
Well, one of the things, which I was the obnoxious undergrad student where Jennifer is now, who just kept pressing professors in class, going, yeah, but I don't think you believe that really happened, right? Like, that's not the conclusion as someone that read the book and then read the books that were footnoted. That's not the correct conclusion. Eventually I got told after class, Tripp, do you want me to do a good job? No one else is ever going to come around to your position if I just answer all your direct questions. I'm like, why would people that theoretically are orienting themselves to the source of all truth be offended as to the nature in which truth is proclaimed in the Gospels? I don't, and I just remember thinking, getting the pulled aside conversation by Jennifer's predecessor, Dr. Penny, and but you know what it was to me that was really helpful, and you mentioned it a minute ago, Dom, was reading all of the early church fathers stuff all around the Tatian argument and him getting condemned and what's going on. So like Dom mentioned Tatian in the early church, Marcion gets rid of the other gospels and has just Luke and certain modified letters of Paul. So it's all nice, consistent for his theological interpretation. But Tatian harmonizes them all. And so like that example of the cleansing of the temple, he's like, well, Jesus did it twice, at the beginning and at the end. You get the Sermon on the Mount, great material. He did a redux though, when there weren't as many rich people around in Luke, and then it was a little more direct, not so poor in spirit.
One from the top, one from the bottom.
Yeah, and you set it up there. And what's fascinating to me, you like get Irenaeus kind of does this beautiful riff on like the four gospels that are being canonized are because they are trustworthy testimonies to the gospel of Christ, and that is the body we are baptized into, right? And so like that, you have the canonization knows, in contrary to like Tatian, that no, it's not like any gospel got canonized, and these four did because they're trustworthy testimonies to the actual presence of Christ in their midst, in the church. And that's why we would not shut them up and tell them to say the same thing. We're going to canonize difference. And so whatever it is your issues are, with all those contrasts and differences, those are issues with the people that chose what went in the Bible. And they literally canonized them and didn't pick the flattened text that's harmonized, because harmonized, singular, flattened accounts are what heretics do. What we do is canonize difference and then say, well, let's go and read, right? And to me, that like what's required from canonizing a multiplicity of testimonies is that we don't confuse the telling for the content, right? Like the form content distinction, which is important for all those of us that love German idealism, but it's also important in hermeneutics, because if the kinds of questions you're asking and demanding a specific answer for force you to like undo the integrity of the text, then what you're sabotaging is the actual testimony of the gospel writer and the church that trusted its witness, and the church that has preserved the story. In many ways, that kind of fundamentalist literalism is muting Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then insisting that they're like atonement theory invented in the early modern period, their obsession with a modernist notion of truth, where they were phobic that they couldn't keep up with the kind of truth science does, rather than recognizing a different register of truth at the very depth dimension of harm. Anyway, like there are all these things that are just getting erasured. And I just find it is so offensive. The high ground, if you think that God is big enough and the ultimacy is something that can seize us and move us, something, right, that would make you say the kingdom I'm a part of is not from here, then the idea that it would be a harmonized, factual, lined up account that you pass a true false test, that's just stupid. I mean, it just makes no sense to me. I can't imagine like why that's compelling. Anyway, sorry, that's Tripp's like ranting about it, but there are too many Tatians that think they're biblical.
One postscript to that. Those four versions, when they put titles on them, were the gospel according to. And bring in Paul, it'd be the gospel. He might say my gospel, the gospel according to. There's only one gospel though. Nobody said I might say it when I'm past speaking four gospels. No. Four gospel versions. There's only one gospel, but that's a person. It's not a book. So it's crucial for me that as a Christian, we are not the people of the book, with all due respect, thanks to Islam. We are the people of the person. It's important for me, as you know now, Jesus, on my classical picture there, Jesus is holding a book and he's not reading it. And he's never reading it. I've never seen him reading it. I've seen him with it open to us. And very often you can read the Greek and it says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, or something like that. That ain't the book speaking. So the gospel is Jesus, basically, the Christ. And the book points us there. But that's crucial. And that's why people say, they don't say WWBS. I'm not, no pun intended. WWBS. What would the Bible say? They say, what would Jesus do? And that's exactly right. That's the heart of Christianity. What would Jesus do or did? So what's at stake here is something profound. We are the people of the person.
And when we immerse ourselves in those stories, all of them, through Matthew, through Mark, through Luke, through John, then we are shaped by the person that they witness to, right? And this is how we become more Christ-like. This is why I think it's great to read all 4 Gospels. It just helps us understand Jesus better and helps us experience Jesus more.
I'd also say, once you recognize the gospel isn't like something that ever gets laid down in words, but something that's testified to by a multiplicity of voices, it might be good to actually let the multiplicity of voices that make up the body of Christ today tell you about their own encounter and experience with the divine, and not give them the language, words, and rights to do it all for them. I mean, like, the number of people that are a part of the body of Christ that's own story doesn't get reflected in the gospel proclamation, even though they've encountered it. And they're told to censure and keep locked up in shame and all sorts of things. We do to people's own bodies and stories what Tatian tried to do with the gospels. But that is an aside, and just, I didn't preach last week, and that happens occasionally when it doesn't happen. But so the last question, and this one's a fun one, before, and I know some of you kept sending resurrection questions, but that's next week. So y'all just have to wait. It's a whole 7 days instead of 3. So sorry, but that's next week. But one of the, where'd it go? Oh, there we go. Andrea asked, different gospels tell the awakening to the meaning of Jesus' execution differently. I wonder how Dom and Jennifer see this taking place in the different gospels. What started it was an allusion Dom made earlier to the road to Emmaus, but you get what's going on, right? So, like, you have the execution stories, and they are kind of like nuancing and orienting it their own. But in the gospels, in different ways, there are the like eureka moments, and they get narrated differently, where maybe the confession at the cross or Emmaus, these kind of things. Like, what's going on with the way the different gospels reflect on the initial experience?
Jennifer, you want to start?
There's a lot going on in John. Like, I have to think about, there's so many little stories after the resurrection, or in the resurrection. There's like, Jesus calling out Mary Magdalene's name, and he's her rabbi, and they get to recognize each other. And then there's Jesus breathing the Spirit on his disciples for that to go out and be the church. And then there's Thomas, who needs to sort of be in Jesus's presence to understand him. And there's Jesus cooking for his disciple. There's like so many little scenes in John that I think, beautiful scenes that talk about when they start coming to understand what it meant that Jesus lived, died, and rose again. So that's for John. I don't know if you want to talk about any of the other ones.
I put a postscript because in the Roman Catholic tradition, especially in the Latin Vulgate, that magnificent scene between Mary that you just mentioned and Jesus in the garden is often described by the phrase "noli me tangere," which means "don't touch me." That's not what he's saying at all. He says, "Don't hold on to me. I got business elsewhere. I have to ascend to heaven. Don't hold on to me. Don't grab me." So it's nothing to do with a woman can't touch him. I'm going to use this as an advertisement, a promotion for the next lecture, which you can always cheat and have read in any case. I think historically that the supporters, the followers, the closest followers of Jesus had visions of him, and watch my language, had visions of him after he was crucified. Let me go further. Let me imagine for the moment, just for the challenge, as we say in Latin, dato non concesso. I don't concede it, but I'll go along with it for the moment. Let's imagine Easter Sunday morning, the tomb was found empty and people had visions. Let me take that as factual. Now, here's the huge question. Not did that happen? I don't think the tomb was found empty. For the moment, let's imagine. We're a court of law, and we've conceded that it happened. The huge surprise is, why didn't it come up with ascension, which the entire Mediterranean would have understood? They mightn't believe it in this case or that, but they all understood that people were taken up to the gods. It happened to the emperors, for example, that Moses. So people, great important generals or important saints, could be taken up to God or the gods. So of course, Jesus was gone because he descended to God. That would be the obvious thing. The huge question is, where on earth did they come up with resurrection? Now that's the question for me. Not, do you really believe this, or did it really happen? Yeah, I'll discuss that if people want to. For example, I'm completely convinced that Mark created the empty tomb story. That's me. But that there were visions, I think, is historically correct. They had visions. You can call them hallucinations. I wouldn't. They're visions. But you have to interpret them. If Jesus appears to you, where is he? Has he ascended to God? The big question for next week is, where did resurrection come from? Not why did ascension? I'd expect that. I'd be very surprised, if after the life they've had with Jesus and the shock of the crucifixion, if people did not have visions, and maybe more women than men, because that's what we find happens. And no, it's not an hallucination or anything wrong with their mind or anything else. It's a absolutely normal part of grieving. If it's not there, you could project it. But the big question then is, why did they go with resurrection and not ascension? Which means that we have to get those two realities clearly distinguished and not kind of mixed up a bit the way they might be. Anyway, that's my promo for next week. Sorry, Jennifer.
No, that's great.
So as we wrap up, Jennifer, where would you want to point people to connect with you? And I'll link books on the post with when the audio and such comes out. But
you can go to my website, jgbashaw.com, or you could check me out at Bible for Normal People, because I have lots of videos and things with them. Yeah, those are the best places.
All right. Well, thank you both for being here, and thank you, all of you, on the stream itself and the conversation and things. After y'all watch the lecture on the resurrection, send questions next week. Diana Butler-Bass is joining us, and I'm sure we will not run out of things to talk about, given the just her text thread about our upcoming conversation. So Dom, you should buckle your safety belt for next week, because I believe Diana is coming ready for some fun.
She's loaded for bear.
Luckily it's on the internet, so only a computer will get harmed.
And Jennifer, it was lovely to have met you.
It was so great to meet you. Such an honor.
Thank you.